The black shirt of the Mafia boss turns crimson in slow motion. The sound of the sniper shot echoes. Seo Jun shoving Jazz to the floor, his massive body acting as a human shield. He looks at her, blood dripping from his mouth, and whispers, "Don't look." Jazz screams his name as bodyguard Lee returns fire. A frantic, high-speed drive through the winding mountain roads. The snow is falling hard. Inside the armored SUV, Jazz is pressing towels against Seo Jun's shoulder. He is drifting in and out of consciousness, muttering about how she needs to leave him because he is cursed. Jazz refuses, her hands covered in his blood, cementing her loyalty. They arrive at the cabin as the storm hits its peak. The armored SUV tore through the white blindness of the Sierraxan Pass, the tires screaming against patches of black ice. Inside, the air was thick with a metallic stench of blood and the roar of the heater fighting the sub-zero gale outside. Jazz knelt on the floorboard, wedged between the front and back seats, her hands pressed desperately against the ruin of Park Seo Jun's shoulder. The black shirt he had worn to the club was gone, shredded to expose the massive expanse of his chest, now a slick canvas of crimson. "Faster, Lee," she screamed, her voice cracking as the car fishtailed violently. "I am trying, Miss Jazz." Lee shouted back, wrestling the wheel as the headlights cut through the swirling snow. Seo Jun groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the leather seat. His eyes fluttered open, glazed, dark, and swimming with shock. He looked down, his vision blurring, and saw her. The maid. The woman he was supposed to protect. Her hands were stained with his blood. Her face was smeared with it. Panic, sharper than the bullet wound, pierced his delirium. He wasn't supposed to bleed. Monsters didn't bleed. They just killed. If she saw him like this, broken, leaking, weak, she would finally realize the truth. "Get out," he rasped, his voice a wet, broken gargle. He tried to shove her away, his good arm flailing clumsily. He needed to hide. He needed to crawl into the dark and die where she couldn't see the mess of him. "Don't look at me. Dirty. I'm dirty. Stop it." Jazz gasped, fighting his strength even as it faded. He was huge, even in this state, a titan thrashing in a cage. "Seo Jun, lie still." "I am a curse," he slurred, his eyes rolling back, tears leaking from the corners to mix with the grime on his face. "I destroy everything. Leave me here. Go." He managed to grip her wrist, his fingers slick and weak, trying to pull her hands away from his wound so he could bleed out in peace. Jazz slapped his hand away. Hard. "Shut up," she shouted, the sound filling the small space, commanding enough to cut through his haze. She grabbed his face with blood-slicked hands, forcing his drifting eyes to lock onto hers. "You don't get to quit. You don't get to be the martyr. You took that bullet for me, Park Seo Jun. You made yourself my shield." She leaned in, her forehead resting against his feverish skin, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "You are not a curse. You are mine. And I am not letting you die in the snow." Seo Jun stared at her, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a terrified, bewildered surrender. He slumped back against the seat, his breathing ragged, watching her through half-lidded eyes as she resumed her pressure on his wound, holding him together when he was falling apart. The cabin emerged from the blizzard like a ghost, a timber skeleton buried in the snowdrifts. Lee kicked the door open, the wind howling as he dragged Seo Jun's unconscious weight inside. It was freezing, the air stale with abandonment. There was no hum of electricity, only the gray, suffocating dark. Lee deposited Seo Jun onto a dusty mattress in the center of the room. He didn't stay. "I have to lead them away," he said, checking his clip. "If I stay, they find us. Keep him warm. Keep him alive." "Lee, wait," Jazz started, panic flaring. "You are the only one who can do this, Miss Jazz," he said, meeting her eyes with a grim finality. Then he was gone, the roar of the SUV fading into the storm, leaving her alone with the dying king of soul. Silence crashed down, heavier than the snow. Jazz turned to the mattress. Seo-jun lay unnaturally still, his breathing shallow and ragged. He looked like a fallen titan, too big for the narrow bed, his skin gray against the darkness of his tattoos. She lit a kerosene lamp she found on the mantel, the flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows. There was no time to be afraid. She grabbed the fabric shears from the emergency kit Lee had thrown her. With trembling hands that steadied as soon as they touched him, she began to cut. The expensive suit, the ruined shirt, she sliced through them ruthlessly, peeling away the layers of his armor until his chest was bare. The sight made her breath hitch. The dragon ink was drowned in blood, the entry wound on his shoulder a dark, ugly mouth pulsing with his heartbeat. It was just like the night she had stitched his hand, yet it was nothing like it. That had been a scratch, this was a chasm. She uncorked a bottle of whiskey found in the cupboard and poured it over the wound. Seo-jun's body jerked violently, a guttural groan tearing from his throat, but his eyes didn't open. He was trapped in the dark room of his mind. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears burning her eyes. "I'm so sorry." She threaded the needle. Her hands, usually so small against his frame, now held his life. She pinched the torn edges of his skin together. He flinched at the first pierce of the needle, his muscles locking up hard as stone. Jazz didn't stop. She stitched through the blood, through the tears, sewing the monster back together with the same fierce tenderness that had made him fall in love with her. She wasn't just a maid anymore, she was the only thing keeping his heart beating. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, but the heat radiating from the mattress was suffocating. Park Seo-jun was burning alive from the inside out. The infection had set in with terrifying speed, turning the invincible warlord into a trembling, thrashing ruin. Jazz sat beside him, wringing out a cloth in a bowl of melted snow. Her arms ached, her eyes burned from smoke and exhaustion, but she couldn't look away. Every time she touched his forehead, he flinched, lost in a nightmare she couldn't see. "No," he moaned, his head tossing restlessly on the pillow. Don't open the door." "It's just me, Seo-jun," Jazz whispered, wiping the sweat that pooled in the hollow of his throat. "You're safe." "Not safe," he gasped, his eyes flying open. They were unseeing, blown wide with a terror that had nothing to do with snipers. He looked right through her. "Look at it. Look at me. It's wrong. The proportions, they're wrong." He tried to curl in on himself, a mountain trying to hide in a mousehole. "My father," he knew. Genetic mistake. A freak of nature. Jazz froze. She had known he was insecure, but this was a self-hatred carved into his very bones. He didn't just think he was big, he thought he was a biological error. "You're not a mistake," she said firmly, reaching for his hand. He ripped it away. "Don't touch," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "I'll break you. Like the others. I crush everything. Too heavy. Too hard. Get away." He began to thrash, his limbs flailing, threatening to tear his stitches open. The sheer power of him, even in delirium, was terrifying. He was fighting an invisible enemy, his own body. Jazz didn't retreat. She climbed onto the mattress, straddling his legs to pin him down, ignoring the danger. She grabbed his face, forcing him to feel her reality against his hallucination. "I am right here," she cried out. "You haven't broken me. Look at me, Park Seo-jun. I am holding you, and I am not breaking." The shout seemed to pierce the veil of his fever. He stopped fighting, his chest heaving, his gaze slowly focusing on her face hovering above him in the firelight. "Jazz," he whispered, a single tear cutting through the sweat on his temple. "You're still whole?" "I'm whole," she promised, collapsing onto his uninjured chest, wrapping her arms around his burning frame. "Now sleep. The monster can't get you while I'm here." The fever broke with the dawn, leaving the cabin steeped in a gray, fragile silence. Park Seo-joon woke to the smell of wood smoke and his own sickness. His body felt heavy, hollowed out by the fire that had raged through him for days. He tried to push himself up, desperate to scrub the feeling of death from his skin, but his arms trembled and gave out. "Easy," a soft voice commanded. Jazz appeared at his side, looking tired but steady. She placed a steaming basin of water on the floorboards. "You're back with me." "I need a shower," Seo-joon rasped, his voice a wreck of gravel. "I smell like rot." "You can't stand, let alone shower," Jazz said, wringing out a cloth. Steam curled into the cold air. "I'll do it." Seo-joon flinched, his instinct to hide flaring up. "No. You've done enough." "I can." "You can barely lift your head, Mr. Park," she interrupted gently, peeling the blanket back. "Let me take care of you." He wanted to argue, to pull the blanket back up and hide the scarred, massive landscape of his body, but he was too weak to fight her. He lay back, closing his eyes in defeat, bracing himself for her disgust. But the cloth was warm. Jazz started at his neck, wiping away the cold sweat and dried blood. She moved slowly, her touch reverent. The contrast between them was a physical ache in the room, her small, dark hands moving against the pale, sprawling canvas of his chest. She traced the lines of the dragon ink that wrapped around his torso, washing over the jagged white ridges of old knife wounds and bullet scars. Seo-joon opened his eyes, watching her. He expected to see revulsion. He expected her to hurry, to get the unpleasant task over with. Instead, her expression was one of intense, quiet focus. She lifted his heavy arm, washing the sensitive skin of his inner bicep, her fingers grazing the muscle. "So many scars," she whispered, almost to herself. "Ugly," he muttered, turning his face away. "A map of violence." "No," Jazz said firmly. She paused, her hand resting flat over his heart, her palm dwarfed by the sheer size of his chest. "History. You survived all of this. And you survived the snow." The water in the basin turned gray, but she kept going, reclaiming him from the filth. For the first time in his life, naked and helpless under the gaze of another, Seo-joon didn't feel like a weapon waiting to be fired. He felt human. And that terrified him more than the fever ever had. The blizzard didn't just bury the cabin, it erased the world. For 2 weeks, time was measured only by the dwindling woodpile and the rhythmic thud of Park Seo-joon's heart regaining its terrible strength. His recovery was unnatural. A man of his size, having lost that much blood, should have been bedridden for a month. Yet, Seo-joon was already pacing the small room like a caged tiger. The cabin felt breathless. Every time he turned, his broad shoulders seemed to brush the ceiling beams or block the firelight. The domestic intimacy, Jazz stirring stew over the hearth, Seo-joon mending a broken chair with his bare hands, was a thin veneer over a simmering, dangerous heat. He was no longer the invalid. He was the predator again, and the small space forced them into a constant, electric proximity. One evening, the tension finally snapped. Jazz was reaching for a heavy iron skillet on the high shelf. Seo-joon was there instantly, his chest pressing against her back, his arm reaching over hers to grab the heavy metal as if it weighed nothing. He didn't move away. He trapped her against the rough wooden counter, the heat of his body scorching through her clothes. "You're recovering fast," she breathed, not daring to turn around, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Too fast," he murmured, his nose grazing the sensitive skin of her neck. He spun her around, his hands gripping the counter on either side of her hips. He loomed over her, vast and intense. The haze of the fever was gone, replaced by a dark, predatory hunger that made the air in the cabin feel thin. You need to stop looking at me like that, he warned, his voice low and rough, vibrating through her chest. You've gotten used to the patient. You're forgetting the monster. Jazz looked up, refusing to shrink away. I haven't forgotten anything. Jazz, he groaned, closing his eyes as if in physical pain. He leaned his forehead against hers, his breathing heavy. We are alone. There is nowhere for you to run. If I start this, I don't know if I can stop. I am too big. It will hurt. It always hurts. He pulled back slightly, giving her an inch of space, an escape route. His dark eyes pleaded with her to take it, to run while she still could. Jazz didn't move. She stepped into the space he had created, pressing her palms flat against the hard wall of his chest, feeling the thunder of his heart beneath the healing scar. I'm not the woman who ran, Seo Jun, she whispered, her voice steady. I'm the one who stayed. I trust you. I trust you. Those 3 words shattered the last of his restraint. Seo Jun kissed her, not with the frantic desperation of the storm in Seoul, but with a terrifying, absolute hunger. He swept her up, his hands encompassing her waist, and carried her to the mattress in front of the dying fire. But as the heavy layers of winter clothes fell away, revealing the pale, scarred landscape of his body against the darkness, the fear returned to his eyes. He lay back, his muscles coiled tight as steel cables, sweat already beading on his forehead. He looked at her small frame, then at himself, and the shame was palpable. I can't move, he rasped, gripping the sheets until his knuckles turned white. If I move, I will tear you apart. Then don't move, Jazz whispered. She placed a hand on his heaving chest, right over the dragon tattoo. Let me. She climbed over him, her knees straddling his hips. The size difference was stark. She looked like a fragile vessel trying to contain a tidal wave. She saw the panic in his gaze as she positioned herself. He squeezed his eyes shut, his head thrown back, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked in his cheek. He was forcing himself to be stone, terrified that even a twitch of his hips would be a violent act. It was a battle of inches. A slow, breathless accommodation. Jazz lowered herself, gasping as the sheer scale of him stretched her limits. It was intense, a feeling of being completely filled, borders pushed to the breaking point. Jazz, he choked out, his eyes flying open, wild with alarm. He started to lift his hands to push her off, to save her from himself. Stop. Please. It fits wrong. It's too much. No, she breathed, catching his hands and pinning them to the mattress, interlacing their fingers. Look at me, Seo Jun, look at my face. He forced himself to look. He didn't see agony. He saw focus. He saw heat. I'm okay, she promised, her voice trembling but sure. We fit. She sank down completely, claiming him. The breath left Seo Jun in a broken rush, a sound that was half sob, half prayer. He lay there, trembling beneath her, waiting for the scream, waiting for the blood. But there was only the firelight dancing on her skin and the rhythm of their joined breathing. See, she whispered, leaning down to kiss the tension from his mouth. You aren't breaking me. You're just holding me. Slowly, tentatively, Seo Jun released his death grip on the sheets. His massive hands came up to cradle her waist, terrified and reverent. For the first time in his life, his size wasn't a weapon. It was an anchor. He wasn't a monster destroying a village, he was a man, finally coming home. The morning sun brought a cruel deception. The blizzard had finally exhausted itself, leaving the sky a piercing, innocent blue. Inside the cabin, the air was still thick with the musk of the night before, a heavy, contented silence draping over the bed where Park Seo Jun slept. For the first time, his face was unlined, his massive arm thrown possessively over the empty space where Jazz had been. Jazz stepped out onto the porch, wrapping Seo Jun's heavy coat around her shoulders. The air was warmer, a false spring that had turned the pristine white world into a slushy gray mess. She took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs, feeling a strange, vibrating happiness. They had survived the bullet. They had survived the fever. They had survived the fear. Then she looked down. The thaw had melted the top layer of snow, revealing what the storm had tried to hide. Tracks. They weren't the erratic prints of a deer or the heavy pad of a bear. They were deep, booted gouges in the slush, deliberate and organized. They didn't just approach the cabin, they circled it. A tightening noose. Jazz's heart slammed against her ribs. She stepped off the porch, the icy mud sucking at her boots, and followed the line of prints toward the tree line. There, stark against the melting white drift, was a splash of color that didn't belong. A discarded lipstick stained with a shade of crimson too perfect, too expensive for the wilderness. Kim Soo-in. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind tore through Jazz. The rival boss hadn't sent a faceless hit squad to reclaim territory. She hadn't sent a negotiator. She had come herself. Jazz looked at the tracks again. They stopped just at the edge of the clearing, watching. Waiting. This wasn't a tactical siege for business assets, it was a hunt. Soo-in had followed the blood trail of the wounded beast, not to put him out of his misery, but to punish him for finding comfort in someone else. The snap of a twig echoed like a gunshot in the silent woods. Jazz didn't scream. She turned and ran, bolting back inside the cabin, slamming the heavy bolt home. Seo-jun, she hissed, shaking the sleeping giant awake. Wake up. The monster is here, and it's not you. The warning barely left her lips before the front window exploded inward. Shards of glass and freezing wind filled the room, followed instantly by the thud of flashbang grenades. Seo-jun didn't hesitate. He didn't dive for cover, he dove for Jazz, shoving her behind the heavy oak fireplace just as the door splintered off its hinges. 3 men in tactical gear stormed the cabin, assault rifles raised. Stay down. Seo-jun roared. He launched himself from the shadows, a wounded bear cornered in its den. He crashed into the first mercenary, the sheer momentum snapping the man's neck before he hit the floor. Seo-jun didn't feel the pain of his shoulder, he only felt the cold, familiar rage. He grabbed the second man's rifle barrel, twisting it with a sickening crunch of metal and bone, and used the weapon to club the man into silence. But the exertion cost him. As he swung, Jazz watched in horror as the white bandages across his chest turned a violently bright red. His stitches had ripped. Blood soaked his torso, slick and fast, but he didn't slow down. He was a demon of violence, fueled by the terrifying need to keep her safe. A fourth man appeared in the shattered window, raising a pistol aimed squarely at the back of Seo-jun's head. Seo-jun was grappling with the third attacker, blind to the threat behind him. No! Jazz screamed. She didn't hide. She didn't look away. She scrambled across the floorboards, grabbing the heavy hunting rifle Lee had left leaning against the wall. It was heavy, smelling of oil and steel. She lifted it, the weight trembling in her arms, and pulled the stock against her shoulder. She didn't think about the recoil. She just thought about the laser dot that had almost taken him from her once. Never again. Crack. The rifle kicked hard, bruising her collarbone, but her aim was true. The man in the window jerked backward, the pistol flying from his hand as he collapsed into the snow. Seo-jun spun around, heaving, his chest heaving as the last mercenary slumped to the floor at his feet. He looked at the dead man in the window, then at Jazz, who was still holding the smoking rifle, her eyes wide but dry. The silence that followed was heavy with gunpowder and shock. Then, slow clapping echoed from the doorway. Kim Soo-in stepped over the wreckage of the door, a small, silver pistol in her hand, her lips curled in a sneer that didn't reach her terrified eyes. Bravo, she spat, aiming at Jazz. The help has claws. She never got to pull the trigger. Seo Jun moved faster than a bleeding man should. He crossed the room in 2 strides, knocking the gun from her hand and gripping her throat, pinning her against the doorframe. The queen had saved the king, now the king would end the war. Seo Jun didn't snap Kim Soo-in's neck, though every instinct in his blood-soaked body screamed for it. Instead, he leaned in, his voice a low rumble of absolute indifference. "You are not worth the bullet," he whispered. "You wanted the beast? You couldn't survive him." He tossed her out the shattered door like a rag doll, straight into the slush where bodyguard Lee's SUV was finally roaring up the drive. The war for the past was over. Seo Jun turned back to the only future that mattered. "Jazz," he breathed, the adrenaline finally crashing, leaving his wounded shoulder screaming in agony. Jazz dropped the rifle, her hands trembling violently. She took a step toward him, a relieved smile breaking through the grime on her face. "We did it. We're safe." "You saved me," Seo Jun said, reaching out with his good hand. Jazz reached for him, but her fingers brushed empty air. The color drained from her face in a single heartbeat. The room tilted sideways. Her eyes rolled back, and her knees buckled. "Jazz!" Seo Jun roared, catching her inches before she hit the floor. She was limp in his arms, terrifyingly light. 24 hours later, the silence in the private clinic was louder than the blizzard had ever been. Seo Jun sat in the waiting room, his torso wrapped in fresh bandages, his head in his hands. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He was vibrating with a terror that no gunfight could provoke. The door clicked open. An elderly doctor stepped out, wiping his glasses, a gentle smile on his face. He had no idea he was speaking to the most dangerous man in Seoul, he only saw a worried husband. "Mr. Park," the doctor said softly. Seo Jun stood up, towering over the man, his breath hitching. Is she dying? Dying?" The doctor chuckled, patting Seo Jun's massive forearm. "Quite the opposite. She is exhausted, yes, and dehydrated. But she is perfectly healthy." Seo Jun closed his eyes, the relief making his knees weak. "Thank God. She needs rest," the doctor continued, his smile widening. "Especially in her condition. Stress isn't good for the baby." The air left the room. Seo Jun froze. The silence stretched, thin and suffocating. He opened his eyes, staring at the doctor with a look of dawning horror. "Baby?" he choked out. "Yes," the doctor beamed. "Congratulations. She's about 6 weeks along." Seo Jun stumbled back until his back hit the cold wall. He looked down at his hands, hands that were twice the size of a normal man's, hands that destroyed everything they touched. He thought of his own childhood, the pain, the doctors who called him a freak, the sheer violence of his own existence. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That's not possible." "Mr. Park?" the doctor asked, confused. Seo Jun didn't hear him. He stared at the closed door of Jazz's room, terrified. He hadn't just given her his heart. He had given her his curse. "A monster," he breathed, tears filling his eyes. "I put a monster inside her."